야, 맞죠. 예타다님이 심지어 탐지게 된다. dob자란남에 바양다바 도배 선지 바르 무지 진짜 토바차. 디에체도 담비치에서 뭐 세연님이 꿀루 끈주기 좀 받는 리바세덤데 셈바슈. 강한 셈바치에 담비치에 대다 청주를 배치면 나제 활동침이 깝기 아니 막에 강사게 담이 당치게 담에 때라 봐봐. 스타티 난생이 강사담에 때라 봐비게. 어 subject din데니만 달하브 대와데 무트니시 마슈기스.
So please generate a clear and strong motivation and think that whatever it takes, I will achieve Buddhahood and do that in order to benefit all mother sentient beings who are as infinite as the limitless space. And that's why we're listening to this teaching. And the Dharma teaching that we are listening to and explaining today is in the great treatise of the stages of the path to enlightenment. And within that, the section about the great insight, great special insight section. And then within that, we're looking at the how to explain and understand the selflessness of persons as well as the selflessness of phenomena.
Oh yeah, that in Madus Malone. Shingdanis, Yala Teda Dang Rangshin Jingmainde, Jigina Yala Tenam Tuma Yimbashindu, Shingda Yang Tuma Jua Tangs, Shingda Jigin Bashindu, Yala Namjang, Jidu Jua Tangs, Cheba Bodang, Chavi Leja, Jidu Jua Sugu Gyudu, Sta, Tadikatula 다 조디다 다랑심에 받텔라 파와스타 각사게 담에 텔라 파웨기디 베딜라 아니 싱다라 베지아니로와 다 싱다디 아니 가르레스나 넘바 듄도 마주바 낭신 아니 다데 넘두도 마주바 레스 베신드 가스나 조 담에 주베지 바디 몽고요와 나네 다 반데 다와 차보기니 우모주번나 수와 시샤시와이나 아니 다 랑심에 받텔라 페어디 다디 랑식이 마주데 아니 가리레 타dun도 마주비 치르스 빼나 싱다신 있습니다. 반대 다 잡아기 어디 빼고 다 싱다디 타dun도 마주비 달라 때네 아니 다디 아니 타dun도 마주비 균생기 랑심 마주 때라 파유데 아니 강사기 담에 때라 파와 세디 차고 인도선이 다 타dun도 마주와데 다 주비 강사 담에 때라 페베지 조디 차데 와 다 강사 담에도 치고 담에니 아니 반에다 와쳐가기 마 제시 잡는데 치고 담에 주비지 받들라 다시 깨워며 봐 세디 군생크 아니 강사 담에 주비지 받들라 아니 남중이지 봐 세니와 디마도스 디톤의 제시 잡여 그래서 다 값을 봐위 아니 강사디 랑신 마주비 군생들라 타들도 마주와리 빼나 신다 나시레스 신다디 타들도 마주와 나신 강사디 아니 다들도 마주가 인상을 상신이 마주가 래 그렇게 시인데 다 간데스는 다 빼라 저거스나 빼든 자야죠 다 디롭지 하고나 야보리 가스나 강사디 상신이 주나 다든전에 니주고 알레 다시 땡도드는 다든 넘버 둥기 그때네 니에 매와 인상 아니 다들랑 다든전에 니에메도 다든전에 니에메상 아니 상신이 주요 말에 신다디 레인데 니 강사 담에 때라고 그래서 다 다든전이 매와디 아니 가스나 강사디 아니 다든전이 넘바도 니주메바 때라 파면도 빼나 고람상 차부로죠. 고람 강사 고람 같은 것도 아니 말한주다 로 차대와 신다 콜로를 빼잖니 신다 콜로디 아니 남든도 마주와 나 신다 콜로디 랑기 다시 된도 다 제일도 남부든 강도에 니에요 말이 그래서 남든도 마주 그게 시인도 다 넘버 20 가진 아니 다 아니 신다들랑 게라레티니 랑와 우들 가지래 랑신 주비 아니 뭐 지도 주바에 말이스 아니 아니 가리래 랑신 주비 뭐 타데도 주바에 말이스 다 품볼라 때마야 랑신 주바 말이스 뭐다 말해 신다들 아니 본네로 랑게 야랄 때마데 랑신 주바 말이스 랑게 야랄 랑신만 수 때마데 랑신 주바 말이스 다 신다디 랑게 야라당 덴바야는 시주 말이스 아니 신다 야라 초सम대야 신다 말이스 신디기 드니 네 가스는 입대야 아니 신다 말레스 오다 두스는 기시인데 다 당부 신다디 랑게 야라 남당 아니 가리래 아니 가리래 다 랑신 주비 찍만 비주제 가르스나 다 신다디 랑게랑 예란랑 신주비 찍이나 아니 다데 데미기 찍세야 되로와 다 데미기 아니 랑신 찍이나 와 찍이마 주부게 지시고 말 데미기 랑신 주비 찍 많이 비 찍이나 껴 가려스나 찍이나 야나 신다디 야라 투마 요바 낭신 신다 콜로데 투마 차도레스 그와 야나 신다디 찍이바 낭신 신다기 야라 투마 요데야 신 찍도 주의 교요레스 그와 어디 교니제 티마세 딘데이나 아니 제바보다 자와디야 지도 주의와 신다당 신다 야라니 야라다 야라진 차라와 그래서 야라 아니 신디 야라도 저당 야라지 신다니 지기나 아니 제바보다 자와야 지도 주의 교요래 신다 돌수도나 교숨 당도와 교숨 신다디 랑게 야라당와 되니 랑신 주비 지기나 다 지기나 스고마다 랑신 주비 지기나 교 가르스나 아니 되메기 지 그와 되메기 지 이나 아니 가리래 아니 신다지당 랑게 야라 아니 콜로라 소바티 여러와 집라 소바 미줄라 소바타 야라 모부저라고 틴조 니 랑신 주비 지기는 지기차루리스다 지기는 교 가려 아니 이런 신다기 야라 투마요바 낭신 신다 콜로데야 투마차루와티 신다 콜로 모부요라고 틴스는 야나 신다디 찍 신다디 야랑게 야라 두비 신다스 찍으와 어디 찍디 요한나신 신다기 야라 투마디야 찍도 타비 교용 그래서 교인 디니체 디마스 아니 야라 신디 야라당 야라 지금 신다니 아니 찍이나 아니 제바보다 자와야 찍도 교요래 그래서 교수무여상 다 둔다도 아니 가리래 신다 야라 투마 요바나시 신다 데 투마 요 말이 신다 지기 번나시 신데 야라 딘도야 지 말이 아니 제바보다 자와야 지 마인상 아니 가리래 신다다 신디 야라니 아니 다데 때문에 지 말이 그래서 정신 주비 지 용의 문도 무슨 이자 리파타부디 뭐 주변도 되는 송샤스
Okay. We'll continue reading, which is page 279 in the version I have here. So we are in it's the second paragraph the second full paragraph. The parts of a chariot are the axle, the wheels, the nails, etc. The chariot is not intrinsically one with those parts. If it were one, there would be fallacies, such as the following. Just as the parts are plural, so the chariot also would be many. Just as the chariot is single, so the parts also would be single. Agent and the object would be the same. Nor is a chariot intrinsically separate from its parts, because if it were, okay, so we'll just focus on the first paragraph. Okay, so we're looking at this way of explaining the selflessness of persons. Okay, so the way that the author here explains the selflessness of persons is through an example, which is to look at a chariot, or we could say a car, but here it's obviously those weren't existent when this was written, so chariot. Okay, so when we look at the example of a chariot, then Chandakirti, in the text called the Entering the Middle Way, or the Madhyamaka Avtara, he explained it through these what's called the refutation of the seven extremes. Okay, and so this is the way that he explains and establishes selflessness of persons. And when it comes to establishing the selflessness of phenomena, then we use, and will come later in the text, what's called the refutation of the four extremes. So this is the main kind of reasoning for establishing selflessness of persons here, the refutation of the seven extremes. And the um, the first step is to use this example. So it's helpful to understand how the example and the meaning of the example are related, or how do you actually uh, kind of apply the example to the meaning of the example. And the way you do that is by first going through looking at the how a chariot exists in relation to its parts, and finding that the chariot is the thing that is the designated object, a designated or labeled object, and or you could say imputed object. That's all different variations of the same Tibetan term, a taktun. So an imputed or designated object, and you look for it in these seven possible ways in relation to its parts, and then you don't find it there, and so then you do that first with the chariot because it's easier to think of a chariot than oneself. If you immediately started off with trying to analyze the self, the person in this way, it's just difficult. So this is why we start with the chariot and analyzing the chariot, the designated object in relation to its parts. And then once we understand how it's not found, the designated object is not found, then we can use that same kind of reasoning to apply to ourselves or the person. And so that's why the example is given. And so first we have, what are the seven again? So the seven are that the chariot is the seven extremes. That is, the chariot is not one with its parts by you know uh, by way of having a nature, by way of having us being established within nature, within maybe it's better to say within being established within nature. So it is not one with its parts within being established within nature. It is not different from its parts within being established within nature. It is not dependent upon its parts within being established within nature, and it is not uh, the other way around, such that the parts are dependent upon it within being established within nature. It not does not possess its parts within being established within nature. It is also not the collection of its parts, and it is not the shape of it's not its shape or a shape. Okay, so those are the seven that are refuted. Okay, so the first of those is one with its parts by within being established within nature. So that's the paragraph that was just read here. So when we say one with its parts within being established within nature, it would be something that is you know not like not distinct whatsoever, a sort of way of being one that is completely independent, a non-contingent oneness that is not different at all from its parts. And so there are three logical flaws, if that were the case, three logical flaws that we can think of, if it did exist in such a way. So the first is that and so again, just to read what the text says, if it were one, there would be fallacies such as the following. Just as the parts are plural, so the chariot also would be many. Okay, that's the first flaw, is that just like the chariot, parts of the chariot, there are many of them, they're plural, then the chariot itself would become something plural or multiple. It would become multiple. So the second flaw, as it says, just as the chariot is single, so the parts would be single. So another flaw is that because the chariot is just one thing, a singular or one thing, then the parts would also have to just be singular. That's the second flaw. And then the third flaw, agent and object would be the same. Okay, so then the agent and then the object of action, the object, being acted upon, and the agent doing the acting, agent and object, they would become one. And that's because when we say parts, right, what we have two things that are in relation. There's the parts, and then there's the owner of the parts, or the thing possessing parts. So that's right, agent and the object. The parts are acted upon, and the agent is acting in the sense of possessing. That's the action, right? So the action and the agent and then the acted upon object, the thing having or possessing parts, and then the parts being possessed would become one. So those are the flaws of that possibility, of the first of the seven possibilities that I refuted, the seven extremes. And again, the parts means here all the various different parts of a chariot. So it has wheels, it has axle, it has the hub of the wheels, it has, all the parts that you can think of. There are many, many of them. Okay, so that's the way that we refute this possibility. We look at these three logical flaws. So the first flaw, again, that if the chariot and the parts were one within being established within nature, then just as the parts are multiple, the chariot would have to also be multiple. Secondly, just as the chariot is singular, the parts would also have to be singular. Thirdly, the parts and the thing which possesses parts would become one, and then agent and agent and object would be one. And the problem there, or the reason that we can see that those are logical flaws, is because, well, the chariot is not multiple. The chariot is not many things or plural. It is not. And likewise, the parts are not singular. They are not just one. And likewise, the agent and the object of action are not the same. They are distinct. So this is how we can see that those are how we can refute or see that those logical flaws are actually logical flaws. So that's how we refute this first of the seven possibilities, seven extremes.
rangi hela namda ngo dribyo soso a maindes ina pubada nambo shinto yagawa soso miba juya les mami bichins ta tadungi riba niwa dirwa ta shingda de rangi yela dang an rangshin dribyo ngo ta chingma inbe gyunzin de gyun yagi dangza suwa ta shingda kolo de rangi yela dang rangshin dribyo soso a mainba de ngo tade mainba de ani 균제 가리스나 다 오타데와 마인비 균제들라 계시 신다데 라게라 랑신 주비 오타데와 이나 아니 랑신 때메기 그러와 아니 소소와 샤구메 베나 품바다 나부 나신스 품바 나부스다 레와 다 제리지 자 품바다 나부세디 아니 제메 퇴시기로 와다 고 소소와와 딘낭신 소소 제메 퇴시기 소소와 이번 낭신 아니 신디 예란이데요. 제메 되시기 소소도 교회res. 장신 주비 소소이나. 근데 제메 되시기 소소 말아봐. 고 신다당 신다 예란이 아니 표주 아니 제와요 이게 표주 뜨는 줄 알아. 신다스디 아니 장기 다시 아니 가스나 예라도라 들어와 콜로다 집어서다 그 예라 강ala 뜨는 샹고게. 어 딘디 예라디야 신디 예라스 나와라 신다大比新的原国根基，地区的今天平时对话的话，也就是那个让新准备说说，那对面参与的，俺普巴的那不能行，俺正面推些，对吧？但结果没变，俺说实话去下午去的，天天门都啊，他起码是俺大比就没把注意起，就你话的个是呢，但新的让给也拉当正面推些个些呢，结果没变些一把呢，俺신다디 랑기 에라라 뜨 스네로 랑기 다시라 로 랑기 답이 두 안으로 답이 시두 메바 주위스다 신다디 랑기 에라라 뜨면이나 아니 그 다시기 로 다시 신다기 강라 다시기 시대 메바 주위스 메바 주어디 가서 코니 제메 신다디 랑기 에라라 뜨면 차도 와고 제메 퇴신 소소이나 아니 그 신디 에라라 다 세기 다세기 시에 메바 주위스 그래서 니기 통에 딘데 인상 싱다 콜로디 아니 가리 말했어. 랑게 야라 문당 랑신 주비 소소야 말했어. 독신 소소이나 아니 부바다 나부 나신 아니 배 소소 제메 되시기 되니 소소랑시 샤고 티야 샤면도 아니 티마세 안 싱다 콜로디 랑게 다시기 아니 매바 주알리 랑게 다시지 여러 와스. 이제 되서 주에서 되메기 소소 왔으면 샤에 우마레 둔다디 어디 디라 때네 가리 주시고 니와 아니 랑신 주비 소소야 말해 그래서 전 남되고 지고 니버디 도스 마주고 도스
Okay, continuing down next paragraph. Nor is a chariot nor is a chariot intrinsically separate from its parts, because if it were, it would be seen separately, apart from them, like pot and cloth. Yet it is not. Also, there would be no reason to impute it in relation to those parts. So this is the second of the seven extremes, the seven possibilities that are refuted. So a chariot and its parts are not distinct within being established by a nature, and the reason for that is because if it were, the reason is to point out the flaws. So the first flaw is if it were, then if they were, if it were like that in relation to its parts, then it would have to become something which is different without being contingent at all on its parts. In other words, it would become completely disconnected, like an entirely separate object. It would become a separate object that's disconnected from its parts. And when it becomes like that completely distinct thing, then it becomes just like a pot and a piece of cloth, pot and cloth. And it says pot, that I know generally pot without an article in front of it means something else. So it means just a pot. So a pot and cloth, right? They're just independent of each other. They're separate objects that are disconnected. They have no relation to each other. So that's how these two would become. The parts of the chariot and the chariot would have to be like that if they were distinct from each other within being established with the nature. And the reality is, again, that's a flaw. That's a way we can refute this possibility, because in reality, they are mutually contingent on each other. So the chariot itself is contingent upon its parts. It relies on its parts. And likewise, the parts are contingent upon the chariot, to be parts. They're contingent upon the thing they are parts of. So in that way, they are mutually related to each other. They are not completely disconnected, separate objects. So that's the first flaw. First flaw, again, that is reflected in the text where it says, nor is a chariot intrinsically separate from its parts, because if it were, it would be seen separately apart from them, like a pot and cloth, yet it is not. The second reason here, then, also there would be no reason to impute it in relation to those parts. So again, I kind of explained it a little bit differently, and also just that the Tibetan word here translated as reason could be translated as something else. So the Tibetan's a little bit unclear, but anyway, the way Geshe explained it, it really is kind of saying that just the whole notion of a basis of designation would become non-existent. There would be, if they were completely separate, then there would be no basis of designation for the designated object, because there's no relation between the parts in the chariot. So you wouldn't have the reality, the situation where there's a basis of designation and then something designated upon it. So that's another problem if they're completely disconnected, separate objects, the chariot and its parts. Okay.
칼숑라 쇼네바 따르당스 랑기 예란남기 띵도야 멜하스 레데라 헤진네 바다 랑기 예랄라 띵네자 메디스 티니 니 랑기 오니게 소소아 유나 주발에 데미 비치로 스타 다딜라디 남중 리바 아니 숨바다 시원이 다고 마제시디 잡주도 지바지 정말 리변데 가스나 다리바 숨바다 시원이 디와 싱다디 랑기 예라라 랑신 주비수기 템바야 말레스 랑기 예라 남장 아니 싱달라 랑신 주비 수 템바 말레스 템템다 틴수니 디와 싱다디 아니 가리레 랑기 예라 남지 랑신 주비 템야 말레 세디 riba namdigo riba sumba diche. Narwa shingda tini rangi yela namla rangshin chungi paa tenpa ya maare sidi ani riba shiwa. Da tini ni ten tenpe riba asi kwa da rwa penzu rwa paa tenpa dang tsu tenpa. Chidang shingda di rangi yela la paa tenpa re. Ine rangshin chubi sugi tenpa ya maare. Shingde yela diya shingda la su tenpa re. Ine rangshin chubi sugi tenpa di maare. Nza di ewa she tuwa go rwa. Da rangshin chubi sugi tenpa ina 아니 되메기 그러와 아니 제와미 비딘수지 샤고도 디이나 베나든다 디 베니 베미다와 니샤도와 다나 가리레 싱다디 랑게라 남기 랑신 주비 때이나 베나 아니 가리레 딘다 디도왕사 칼숑라 쇼네 바탈스 다 쇼룩사기 뉴제로와 쇼룩사기 뉴 딜라 쇼딘수디 아니 가리래 군이 아니 가리래 뭐 타데비다 딘수지 차대로와 뭐 타데비 딘수지로와 너와 쇼당 쇼루사기 뉴스디 고뭐 타데로와 그래와 인도전에 딘디기 딘수지 샤요 말이 신디 야라디 신다로 뭐지로와 인도전에 뭐 딘디 뭐 타데기 나디 가리래 랑신 주비 때문에 때 차와이나 신디 엘라디 신다라 랑신 주비 때 차와이나 아니 뭐 다디비로와 쇼당 아니 쇼네사기 뉴디 낭신기 오늘 뭐 다디비 딘주주 샤월 티샤에 메비치르서 준전 티제 다 신다라니 아니 신다 콜로라니 랑기 엘라라 랑신 주비 파 때만 많이 받디 아니 레데 당 해진 와 레데스나다 콜 기질기로와 지버기다 딘지기로 왔다 걸어왔다 심징이다 지바 다 부시 차보주스 저다 제테스도 딜 지바기 수주 쿠르 와 쿠르나니 쿠다즈 메바진다 심징이다 베나 딘데 야당 딘데기다 지바중으로 지바신다 디 부디 데즈 다 루기 부당 야기 부디 데즈 총을 저기 말아왔다 인 야기 부디 딜 지바라게 루기 베들라 데즈 잠바요와 이제는 다 고르소에 대해서 차보도 지금 돈이 있어요 공전이 다 레데다 해진스도 다 해진당다 돈도 레데스도 고르기 지체 고르로 다 고르 어다 레데당 해진이와 해진디 레데라 파데바 나시 오타디 비텐수저라 오 디야샤요 말레스 오 싱다디 랑게라라요 아니 오타디 바로와 파 해진디 랑기 대사기 쿨라 파 때문에 오타디 비텐수저라 오 티텐주 낭신기 아니 싱가디야 아니 랑기 예라라 아니 제메 두시기 제메 나오다 오 타디 비뚜주지 샤고알레 티요 마레스 오 딘데 레델 진네 바테마 메데 티니니 랑기 오니기 소소 유나 두발라 데미 비시로 누자니 다 베니도 베니 티니스디 가르레 쇼당 쇼루사기 뉴데 오 타디 비뚜주 레진당 레진 대사기 쿠르디안 오 타디비 뚜주나 신기 아니 신다당 신기 예라라 오 타디비 뚜주지 샤고알레 디 뚜주지 민도 다 신다디 랑게 예라라 오 타디비 뚜나야 오 타디비 뚜주 샤고도 신디 예라디 신다라 추 아니 라시 주비 때나야 오 타디비 뚜주 샤고도 인데즈네 어디 오 타디비 수 뚜주데 요 말레스 가스나 신다당 신디 예라리 아니 뭐 지그와스 와 신디 시디 신디 야라 뛰네 신디 야라 시디 신달로라 샤가 어때 두치니 다 도르스구나 신다다 신디 야라니 뭐 지그와스 이르자니 뭐 지비주기 뛰어바래 모도지 뭐 타디비주기 뛰수도 요 말레스 매상 아니 파랑 신주비주기 때마야 말이 랑기 야람조야 신다콜로 추랑 신주비주기 뛰어바 매상 아니 가리래 어 신다디 아니 가리래 어 안되는 랑신 주비 땡땡바 세디 되는 신다의 신대라는 랑신 주비 땡땡바 세디 매장 아니 리바 숨바당 리바 시비 규제라 땡네 안 신다디 랑기 다시데도 아니 답변은 니주미 규제도 순주봉도
Okay, next paragraph. Two of the positions involve positing a chariot and its parts as basis and dependent. A chariot is not the basis for its parts, like a bowl holding yogurt, nor does it rest in its parts, like Devadatta in a tent, because such relationships could be demonstrated only if a chariot and its parts were essentially separate, but they are not. Here, we do not refute mere mutual existence. We refute a basis and dependent that exist by way of intrinsic character. Even the two examples just mentioned refer to situations in which the other party accepts that there are intrinsically characterized basis and dependence. All similar cases should be understood in this work. So the next of the seven extremes that are refuted are the third and the fourth one taken together, and they're it's the same reasoning for both of them, the same way of explaining both of them. And so the first one is that the chariot is not dependent over upon its parts within being established within nature or intrinsically, nor are the parts sort of internally kind of coming back with dependence on the chariot within being established within nature, or in this style of being established within nature. And so these are two different ways of dependence, as it says here, the reasoning of the basis and dependent. So the chariot and parts in general, they do have a relationship of being dependent and basis. Dependent and basis. The chariot kind of being dependent over on its parts, the parts being dependent internally back upon the chariot, but not within the style of being established within nature, not through being established within nature or in an intrinsic style. Yeah, it's not the way that they are dependent. So it's very important that we make this distinction. We have to make this distinction. So if they were, if they had dependence, if the chariot was dependent on its parts within being established within nature, again, it would have to do such in a way of dependence that was disconnected and non-contingent. It would be a disconnected and non-contingent kind of dependence upon its parts. So the example is given to help understand this. It would be like yogurt and a bowl or a container that holds yogurt. Okay, so when a yogurt is sitting in a bowl or container, the way that the yogurt is depending on the bowl is in such a way that it is of a different nature from the bowl. It is not one essence, but a different nature or different essence from the bowl, even though it's depending on it. That's the kind of relationship where it would be, it would have to be for the chariot to be dependent on its parts within being established within nature. It would be such a dependence so that it was of a different nature from the parts. But the truth is, the reality is, chariot and its parts are one nature. They are not different natures like a yogurt in a bowl that it sits in. And so this is the flaw with that. It's explained by that example that it would have to that if there was this kind of dependence of the chariot on its parts within being established within nature, it would have to depend on it within being the different nature from its parts. Okay, now the next example talks about a tent and Devadatta living in the tent. I'll just explain the term here for a tent is from especially kind of tough kind of fur, like a yak's fur, something like that. But anyway, a tent. So Devadatta is, and this is similar. Another example where Devadatta is of a different nature from the tent, as Devadatta is sort of living within. Ale Loshina, okay. Well, they can still hear me. You can still hear me, right?
That's correct. We can still hear you.
So that's fine. So the way that Devadatta lives in a tent is it would also be of a different nature where he's dependent on it, but through being of a different nature from it. So this is the way that things would have to, that the chariot here would have to be in relation to its parts if it were dependent within being established within nature. If it were dependent within an intrinsic nature, it would actually be dependent but of a different nature from its parts. And since that's not the case, then this is not how it exists. This is a refutation of the chariot being established by way of nature. So Geshe is just going to try to get a backup light, it seems, but I should just open the blinds because the sun is coming up.
Yeah. Okay, sorry here, light problem. Yes. Oh yeah. 졸업해서. 어두시 다들 펜준 여바자 무고기 때나 때 말한게 친이기 주바 고바우스 베주니 숨바 대한 바로바 대다 라랑게 친이기 때때바 주비 시작 고바데 딘자와 탐제라 티슈도 셰바 차우스 다 어두신 다진다 때때바 고에 대한 드니 신다다 신디에라 때때바 고부 주바데 타니도 땐때만 이마 고바디 말해스 랑게 친이 주비 땐때만 이마 고고레스 유전 디십자 진다디 신다디 아니 가리레 랑싱 주나 아니 랑기 다시 랑 랑싱 주비 땐때만 고도 세저와 랑싱 주비 수기 땐파 파땐바다 레란도 랑싱 주비 수기 땐때만 티 kindeji 고발에 티지기 민도 신티카고 얼마도지 신다다 신디에라 니 땐때바 이바디 좀 고고 말이스 뭐고 하거든 신다다 신디에라 니 땐때 말와 펜주 땐때 말해 펜주 땐네 대로와 신다들 시디랑게 에라 땐네 대로와 이나요 단위도 땐때 이바디 고고 말해 스랑신도 땐때 이바 고고 말해 스케지 시인데 다디 리과디 지당 가리래 랑신도 뭐 타데 세드마 추와래 타드 지당도와 타드의 리바디 뒤나 니스 뒤와 인스티튜트의 리바와 라신 주비 직당 타데 강로도 마주의 치르세 리바티니라 되네와 이게 강사 당면 나와 고민도 아니 지단 투마 요나 지단 투마 요거도 아니 뭐 지단 투마 강도 민도 무슨 어떤 디 투마 고비 싶어들라 최바리 그래서는 디 랑신 주비 아니 템바이나 아니 랑신 주비 아니 가리래 퇴신 와 tindeji 고고를 모두 지기 탄예도 랑시 주바 고수들라 야 추교 말이 어떤 tinde와디 답배 뒤었더니 시에 돼요 아니 숨바대 바로 봐 와다 나갑기 총아 가리래 랑싱 주바 켈랭게 아니 총아 바로 비대비 온도 전에 되는 신작이 댄스기 빼고 말이스 어다 tinde비 빼고 좀 강가 난다디 아니 바로 벽이 되니 켈랑라 진이 꾸비现在给电视给背影吧的，今天后来今天背上来的几把几样子，今天话他们就提醒的些把巧务是的，那就说我的的，那新的的，安尼人也了的，让新主备电吧伊那，安尼考上了学电吧当，苦了黑心电吧能生的的呢，安尼考虑嘞，我他的比电视剧高度是背过来的，安尼拍了不啦，安尼让新主备签领给我们完了，安尼铁大国别红的钱呢，现在给电视给背过吧嘞。我的地背过的，他后来新到可能背几个家了吧，他新到个国家也那个背的了，然后按那考上当，按那学当，按那雷军当热的可怜了，他今天呢，按那这个多啊，是背的你小人的，按那做不来了，为啥？现在给开朗了这面上，现在给电子给背过吧嘞，说的的，我都是嘛送读送。
So reading back this second half of that paragraph, okay, so here, the word here we do not refute mere mutual existence. We refute a basis and dependent that exist by way of intrinsic character. Even the two examples just mentioned refer to situations in which the other party accepts that there are intrinsically characterized bases and dependents. All similar cases should be understood in this way. The way that the relationship or the possibility of basis and dependent that are talked about here are being negated, is not, they're not being negated through conventionally being dependent, conventional dependent and basis. They're not being negated that way. They're being negated in this style of intrinsic establishment, or within being established by nature, then being dependent and basis. So the parts of the chariot being the basis and the chariot being the dependent, in this kind of interrelation, this mutual relation, is only being refuted in terms of things being established within nature and then being basis and dependent. So the reasoning here, it follows from the same reasoning of refutation of things being established within having a nature as different, as different or distinct. Now, in general, when we do the kind of reasoning in the meditation on these, then we can start with just the basic principle. If something exists, then it, something that is, if something's established within nature, then it's necessarily either singular within being established within nature, or it's plural. It's plural, i.e. multiple, within being established within nature. So something or some things, I guess you would say. So in general, just as a first step of that reflection or meditation, then you can think that if something exists at all, right? If something exists, then it's necessarily either singular or plural, either one or different, singular or plural. And the same with if something were established with a nature, it would be either singular within being established with a nature or plural within being established with a nature. Those are the two only options. So this one here, where we're looking at the dependent and the basis, is following from this reasoning of that they're not different within being established with the nature, the parts of the chariot and the chariot. And the reason that it's sort of set out as a separate kind of reasoning or a separate line of reasoning is because, well, it really is a response to other people who had this view. They had this position that that the parts of the chariot and the chariot could be intrinsically in a relation of intrinsic basis independent or basis independent within having a nature. So that's why this is set out as a separate refutation with its own example. So the examples of the yogurt in the bowl and then Devadatta in the tent, are given, even though the actual, the whole section here, we're using an example the whole time, the chariot and its parts. So we're already using an example, but now here again, Tsongkhapa gives another example to understand that example better, just because again, it's even easier. So it's a very clear and easy way to understand the point being made by giving these two examples here. And again, they're given especially to answer to actual, other people who had this view or this position. And so it's specifically meant to refute a specific wrong position that someone has, that another you could say philosopher has.
Yeah. 어떤 dembe choja 밑에 대해서 디달 해지 되신도 주비 발랑 안탐 demba 신도 싱다양 랑기 야라다 demba 되나니 발랑다 해지 소소 짐바 대 진짜와 대신도 싱다양 랑기 야라레 소소와 지고발레 미즈비치 대다 demba 메도스 다디 리본나와 다 싱다디 랑기 야라 당 랑신 주비 랑기 야라 당 랑신 주비 수 demba 말했습니다. 다 디지 방어와디 다디 덴바 신도 콜로디 랑게 열라도 덴바다 해와 랑게 열라도 덴바레데 이네 랑신 주바 오니기 수기 덴바디 마레스 랑신 주비 수기 덴바디 마레스 다 랑신 주비 수기 덴바이나 아니 교 가리도스 노디다 레제 되시는 주바 양다바 덴바 신도 신가랑게 덴바 되나니 되니 교 가리스나 아니 발랑당 레지 해지 발랑다 대스 해지스의 강사지로와 미지 아니 발랑다 대스기로와 아니 뭐 타대비 된주지 셔요 말이스 그와 해지스의 강사디 발랑다 덴바레 세디 해지다 발랑스 벳코랑 갈려래 제메트시 답변 콜로라 샤윈디 벳콜로와 샤야지요로와 어 디난시기 디니 소수위 된주지 셔요 거래 어디 신다다 신디야라 디셔요 말이 가스나 신다라도 신디 야라디로라 샵도 고미지 신디 야라스디 아니 대다 초비 신다디로라 샵을 이두전이 소수의 된주지 신다디 랑게 야라디 덴바르데 아니 뭐 소수는 샤주의 된주지 셰미도 와스 계시 신다디 랑게 야라다 랑신 주비 수비 덴바이나 아니 뭐 소수 그와 뭐수 때메기 다 도르수드나 랑신 주비 덴바이나 때메기 된주지 시샤고레 때메기 된주이나 뭐사 소소니 아니 무진 치투겐기와 소소니 되는 뭐 소소니 시샤 투겐기 된주지 요거레 오다디 아니 가스나 가릴라 요 말했어 신다다 신기야라 딘데비 무사수비 무소소비 와시 다 나디 발랑 레지 발랑다 데스비 발랑스비 아니 파주도 삼로코에도 레지스의 강사들 삼로코에 네바 요 말에 레지 삼로코디 발랑디 삼로코고요 말에 이네 발랑디 레지나 발랑 요레 데바레 세디 깨지 셰어와 이나 티 딘주는 신기 신가디 랑게야라 랑신 주비수 데스 딘주디 셰요 말에스 랑신 주비 데스 데바이나 아니 뭐 소소니 샤주 여기 딘주지 샤고도 다 무엇이었습니까 소소니 와 신다 라디드니 신디에라를 노수지 와 신디 지단 고 신다 신디 예라를 뛰는 샤와 타라 신디 예라도 신다를 뛰는 샤와 누자니 티인상 뭐 신디 신다 신디 예라 로라 샤와 뛰고게 신다 예라 신다 로라 샤와 뛰고게지 모두 지기 발랑당 해직 나시기 아니 소수는 로라 샤주지 요마해스 매장 가르주고 그래 신다디 랑기 예라다 덴바리데 랑신주비 덴바디 마레스 모두 신이다 지도 나와디 티투도 하도 이거 나와
So now we'll move to the fifth reasoning, or the fifth of the seven possibilities or extremes that are refuted. The possibility of possession is also untenable. If you hold that a chariot possesses its parts, just as Devadatta possesses oxen, i.e., as objects other than himself, then just as the oxen and Devadatta are seen separately, a chariot and its parts should likewise be seen separately. A chariot and its part, yet they are not, sorry. So let me read that again. Then just as the oxen and Devadatta are seen separately, a chariot and its parts should be seen separately, yet they are not. Thus there is no such possession. So now we're looking at the question or the possibility of possession. And so we're refuting that the chariot possesses its parts within being established within nature, or possesses its parts in such a style as to be an intrinsic possessor of its parts. So again, generally speaking, yes, the chariot does possess its parts. Parts are possessed by the chariot, but not in such a way as that it is intrinsically established possessing its parts. And the example to understand this would be like an ox and Devadatta. So we can say that yes, Devadatta possesses his oxen. And how is it that Devadatta possesses his oxen? Again, it is in such a way that he is of a different nature from the ox. Right? It's through the style of being a different nature from the ox that he possesses it. But we can still say that Devadatta possesses an ox. And so this is the meaning here of being of a different nature is that it's like when you think of it. So here it says seen. The word, and again in Tibetan, doesn't actually specifically refer to like visual seeing. Okay, it could be any kind of mental engagement or any kind of observation. So it doesn't refer to specifically visual seeing. And so Geshe in the explanation, he really was saying when you think of it, you're thinking of it with your thought process, your conceptual thought. You're thinking of it of Huijin, then you don't have to also be thinking of his oxen. You can think of them separately, right? Because they are distinct objects that are disconnected from each other. So when you think of Huijin, you don't have to think of the oxen. You think of the oxen, you don't have to think of Huijin. You think of them independently. So that type of so if a chariot and its parts had such type of relationship with possession, the chariot possessing its parts, it would have to possess the parts in such a way that it was again independently possessing them or not contingently possessing them. And that would mean that it would have to possess them in such a way that it was that the parts in the chariot were of a different nature. They had distinct natures. That means that when you think of the chariot, then you would not have to think of the parts, like with Devadatta and his oxen. But the truth or in reality, when you think of a chariot, you also, you're also thinking of its parts. When you think of a chariot, you can't not think of its parts. And when you think of the parts of a chariot, you can't not think of the chariot. Okay, so you have to think of kind of the parts while you think of the chariot, and you have to think of the chariot while you think of the parts. When we say here think of, it just means doesn't mean like you don't have to have any specific thought about them. Just the fact that it's there is I mean the literal word is that there's an appearance in your mind of the chariot. There's an appearance in your mind, and you're having there's some appearance of a chariot there. Then the parts also you have to are being thought of. And when you have the appearance of the parts of the chariot is also being thought of. Okay, so that's why it is different here from the case of Devadatta and his oxen.
뭐야? 다 레진 나와다 되노 셰바다 싱다 예라다 덴바야 미르데스 랑시 타데바 까비치나 랑기 모니기 두바 덴수디니 랑시 집이 초이라 대응을 까비치로스 대응 레진 나와다 덴바 점 타녀도요 봐 미고 봤다 싱달라야 임베 랑기 친이 주비 덴바 고고 스타든다디 덴바 지방 나와디와 깝스로와 다든다 드니 뭐 타디기 드니 랑시 주비 덴바이나 뭐 타디비 덴바 고도 세들라 아니 학 디바루라 토바지들와 아니 뭐 집이 수비 된주죠래 맨날 해진 나와다 대스들와 해진스게 강사들이 나와요와 암조 아니 가스나 다 나고요 나고 다 해진 스비 강사들이 아니 가리래 랑기 나와다 대스니 시주디 랑신 진리 외랑신 주기 투 된주지 셰도 된낭신 신다디라 랑게야라 다진리 가스나 디네지 덴바지 샤고도라 대시나 디야 딩마레 된주들라 랑신 주비 수비 된주 제당 랑신 타디비 수비 된주 니샤요 나니 다 랑신 타디비 수비 된주드니 강라 아니 가리스나 레지 발랑다 덴바디기 된주 값을 까봐도 치고지장래 라이언티 지시 장도스 다 랑신 주비 지비 수비 된주디 샤와이나 아니 랑신 지 차주레스 근데 자니 아니 레진당 베이징기 나와라 소바 대다 랑신 지이나 아니 누가 아니 지도 주기 교연 그래 그래서 랑이 친이 주비 지도인다 랑이 친이 주비 오 지비 수비 된주디 샤와이나 랑이 친이 주비 지인 거래 떼매기 지이나 아니 가스나 아니 다기 강라더니 가리래 투마 아니 신다 투마 신디에라 투마에 만나시 신다야 투마 주고기 신다디 지기 만나시 신디에라 지도 주고 어디기 교지 당로 뒤다 집어 지장기 교 주고래 루산다 도르스드나 신다디 아니 랑게라당 아니 와고 타데비 수비 된주지 셰 말에 근데 랑신 주베스 오다 랑신 주비 뭐 타데비 수비 된주지 셰 말에 랑신 주비 뭐 지비 수비 된주지 셰요 말에 인도산이 다 디갑수 해진데 내내 랑게 나와다 덴바디 랑신 주비츠기 데주디 까고를 마도지 타니도요 바까고 마티나시 싱달라야 아니 랑게 예라다 아니로 랑신 주비츠기 데주디 까고를 마도 타니도 데주디 까고 말 싱다데 랑게 예라다 타니도 덴바로와 이네 랑신 주비츠기 데주디 요 말레스 랑신 주비츠기 덴바이나 아니 가리레 뭐 타디비 데주 아니 그지 가리레 발랑다 레진 낭신 레진 발랑다 데스디 아니 레진다 발랑 그뭐 타디비 니 조주요와 낭신 아니 신다다 신디엘라데야 뭐 타디비 수기 된주 샤고도 어다 딘디비 된주요 말해 스니자 이 조디 랑신의 주비 초라 가고래 모두지 타니도 마가와디 콘도 셰바도 지바 지장래 인자디 주비요 말해 스타지르미지 어다리 번가비가 수디네스 수우고 세시
So in the same paragraph, it is also unreasonable that a chariot should possess its parts, just as Devadatta possesses his ear, because we are now refuting intrinsic difference. Okay, so the emphasis should be on intrinsic. So thus there's no such possession. It is also unreasonable that a chariot should possess its parts, just as Devadatta possesses his ear, because we are now refuting intrinsic difference. For things that exist essentially, this type of possession would involve intrinsic oneness, and we already refuted that. Again, we do not refute the conventional existence of Devadatta's merely having an ear, and the same applies to the chariot. Thus, we refute intrinsically characterized possession. This is staying with the fifth reasoning here. We're still in that same part of the same reasoning. And so now we are looking at a possible example, or someone could give a possible, give rise to the question or have some doubt about the previous reasoning that was just finished, and then say, well, but what about this kind of example of Devadatta possessing his ear, where they are they are also one nature, not different nature. So the previous example of Devadatta and the oxen, where that was refuting the relationship of possession, of possessing something, right, within being of a different nature. Again, here refuting possession by way of a nature, possession within having a nature, intrinsically possessing something. So now the example that's brought up is in this question is, but what about Devadatta? He has, his ears, his nose. He possesses these things, but they're one nature, right? So he's possessing them in a style such that in the style of being one nature with them. So the difference from before is that was a case where there was a possession of something within being of a different nature. Okay, but there's still a flaw in this with this possibility, because if the Devadatta was again intrinsically established as having, or established through having a nature as possessing his ears, etc., etc., then they would become one nature. They would become intrinsically one nature within having within being established by way of a nature. And so they would then become, again, what does it mean to be established one nature within being established with a nature? It means that it would be without contingents being one. It would be one in a non-contingent way, independently one. So they would again become one within being established with a nature, which was already refuted in the very first of the 7 possibilities, right? I was looking at how if the chariot and its parts were one within being established with a nature, then the chariot would have to become multiple like its parts, or the parts would then become just a singular thing like the chariot. So that was already refuted. Okay, so this is saying that, so this possibility here, this person thinking of this example, it just goes back to that first of the 7 possibilities that was refuted. And so again, this is saying that there could be 2 ways of thinking about possession here, where you have possession within being established with the nature. It could be possession within being established with the nature, such that the 2 things are one nature. And just so you know, there's different terms here. We could say one essence or one nature, but they're used interchangeably. So one established with a nature, within being established with a nature being one nature, or within being established with a nature being a different nature, different essence. Okay. And so what's being negated here is, again, this possible or this theoretical possession that is established within being established with a nature, possession intrinsically. So we're not refuting here conventional possession. There's a way of possessing something just conventionally that is not refuted here. So as it says, that's the text itself said. So it's only kind of within the range of possible the things being refuted here are within the range of this theoretical type of or hypothetical type of existence within being established within nature, existence intrinsically. That's what's being refuted for possession here, not just conventional possession, because conventionally a chariot possesses its parts, and Devadatta does possess his ears and nose.
오야 다 도시네 다 된다 대신에 직방가 디값수 다조 아니 신다디 아니 저지가 직바디 신다디랑 게 다시 로 예라 로 신다 아디랑 게 다시 예라게 땡도 아니 장신 주비 지기도 주바야 니즈메 장신 주비 다디도 주바 니즈야미 장신 주비 땡땡바 로 펜주 땡땡바 장신 주비 수 땡땡바 데니즈메 어 장신 주비 수 땡주데 니즈메 와라 땡네 다 지바 대달라 때네 다 신다디 랑기 다시 된도 째네 다든 째네 최지가 지비 니에면도 누자네 다 다든 째네 니에면서 아니 라신 마주바 세기 삼모디 아니 땅 투고요나 아니 강사게 때도 되는 수 삼모디 빼자는데 아니 로라 강사디 아니 최지가 지바디 랑기 다시 된도 아니 지바 된 째인데 아니 뒤집어 지장 아니 라신 주비 지다 다대당 랑신 주비 덴바당 랑신 주비 덴바라 소비 어디 제주디 제니 매발레인데 아니 다디 랑신이 미주 스면이 강사 담미기 다와들 아니 코알레디도 스지바디 리고레 어두인자 다딘다디 제레라서 못하나 고직섬 대섬기 매개로 코야 dom니는 섬 땅인데 아니 가리기 지바들 그것도 쓰는 아니 다 랑신이 마주바디 다 주지기 지바디 랑기 다시데도 아니 지다 다대다 그리고 랑신 주비 지다 다대 랑신 주비 덴덴바 랑신 주비 덴주덴 매바디 신디 띵네다 딘데스 신가 띵어 주로라 차디고 시여와 강사 스디로라 때 차고 부벌었다면 맞음 강사 세디 로라 차가 보여 아나도 파스모 땅이도 강사 스디 랑기 풍벌었더니 가스나 녹수지 그리고 딘디기 농수지 레고래 강사 세다 강사기 풍벌었으디 로라 셔주디로와 아니 가스나 고랑 소소니 로기 되니 배지 소소니 사 tindig ligor de mubinisura tindeji yomarwa timmezuti pedene mashina ani yomar induzanita maranzu tawa gomge nare parubala kaduine di ani shinda kolodi pejalla goza pande tawa tutun jawares induzanita jibal hamani de jela dasani jeshidegi ani tirin tindeji zamshagi ani chiwachilo na gozuro chis ya.
So these 5 different types of reasoning here, when we're meditating on them, going through them, thinking of them, we start again with the example of this chariot example. And we go through and we are looking for the designated object to exist in any of these possible ways. And so we check first, is it established within having a nature, within being established within nature? Is it one with its parts? Within being established within nature, is it different from its parts? We don't find it in either of those two cases. And then we ask, is it within being established within nature dependent on its parts? We don't find it again. Is other parts dependent on it within being established within nature? We don't find it again. Is it possessing its parts within being established within nature? We don't find it again. So we are looking in all these different ways to find the designated object, the imputed object, and then we don't find it. So then we can come to the conclusion that the chariot does not exist in is established within nature. It does not exist intrinsically, in other words. So the reflection here, using the example of the chariot, then we can use the same reasoning, right, to then apply to the self, the person or the self. And so with the person, then you can analyze in the exact same way, looking, what we're doing is searching for the designated object, okay, and not finding it. And so we can, initially think of each of these lines of reasoning independently, separately from, one by one. Then, it's sort of, it doesn't have such a powerful impact yet. But then when we understand them, then we think of all of them together in relation to the person or yourself. And then it's really, you can see how the self is not established in nature. And then you see, then you'll be able to think about that and understand that. And again, we start with this example here of a chariot because it's easier to think of. It's easier for us to bring it to mind. The chariot is a little bit simpler. Just thinking of a person. What is a person? Again, the definition. A person is a being who is designated, merely designated upon the five aggregates of a person. So the that sort of definition or understanding that we have to kind of think of, okay, what are the five aggregates? What is a person, right? These are a little bit harder to bring to mind, to conceive of. Much easier to conceive of a chariot. So that's why that's used as an example. So we can more easily understand the chariot not being established intrinsically. Then we can apply it to ourself, the person who is designated upon the five aggregates. So for today, we're running low on time, so we can stop the explanation and finish the remainder of this section, the last two reasonings in the next class, and then we can have some question answer if there's any questions right now.
아주 풍부하다 아니 풍부 가서 수급 풍부다 아니 수급 풍부인 예나다 예나 여러 디주 아니 단다 릭바 당분이 시버도 잘 아니 릭바 나와디 다다 다기를 자시나 디디프친 고알리는 디기나 간데나 디다다시 디기는
Dagiwa line dagiwa.
No, 다다 다기와.
Okay. So the question is, the question is asking, like, the way it seems to make sense to me, or is it okay if we understand it by saying that the first of the four reasonings, or the first of the four extremes being refuted, would it make sense to say that those are for meditating on or in relation to establishing the selflessness of the self itself in relation to the self, or a person, whereas the fifth one would be better applied to the selflessness of the possessed by the person, that which is possessed by the self, or the mind, if you can say the mind. That's the question.
Also, 아니, 근데 다지 comme la sourire dans le texte, 다다 못된 게 저지가는 가서는 근데 다다 다기와 세제와 다기와 세대 수급 풍부를 써봐도 돼요. 강사기 수급 풍부를 써봐도 돼요. 다기와 당을 샤워해. 또 다기와디 로수체 수급 풍부를 써봐도 되니 야라도 니라 세대 로수 샤요 말이야. 다 강사기 수급 풍부를 써봐 야라도 니라라 파 제바 지수디 다다 다기와기 제바 지수 다라래. 다기와스는 다기 롱제적이 아니 풍부도 샤워. 그래서 다기 롱제적이 풍부들라 수급 풍부 좀 강가디나 추되고 와. 인도스네 다다 다기와 제바 다라시. 어디 가서는 강사기 되니 야라 수급 풍부라 수급 풍부 야라라 소가 니라스니 디로스 디체 안 다기와디 상무 노수 코교 말에 다기와스에 나라 수급 풍부라 소가 좀 강가 뒤되래. 강사기로와 수다 강사기다 지가리래 소화다 다 풍부 강가 다기와 당부도 말하는 좀다 모주치도에디 다도 다기와스디 간제지레스나 다 쓰디 아니 된다디 단위도 다라나 아니 풍부라 야 대바징 야라지 잡지 아니 다기와스디 아니 풍부 되니 뒤솔라 되니 대시집에 다기 야라이 말이지 그래서 야라다 야라지 다다 다기와 다고 자위찬이 민다와와 다기와스디 아니 다기와 나이 롱제제 비찬이 다기와스다 그래 그래서 나이 롱제제 나가 아니 마다 나이 롱제제라 봐 제바 조인디 아니 강사기 아니 수급 풍부다 계속 강가라 제바 조고 인도전이 인다디 풍부 계시 강사기 다시도 제바 제바이나 리파 당문가가 디날리고 그리고 강사기 야라디 아니 뭐지다 다들 가리랬어야 다다 다기와 디 오지다 다데 가리레세다 강사다 강사기 수디 오지다 다데 가리레세디 이르버 건가라 두고 다 어두 체되더니 다다 다기와 세디는 강가 추고래 어두신데 다 로수 샤이게 디 제바디 줘요 말이스 어딘다 디슈에 일어서
터치나.
So that idea is it's not exactly on point, because when we are talking about these 7 things being refuted, or the 7 lines of reasoning, and then talking about the self versus the mind, or the I and the mind. Well, the mind it means the aggregates, right? The self has the aggregates. In other words, they're not things that are thought of and completely different at different times, or we don't think of the mind separately and then the aggregate separately, because when we're doing the analysis of the I, we're doing the analysis of the mind. Doing an analysis of the mind, we are doing analysis of the I. When we're so the analysis of the self is the analysis of the mind itself. So, if we just think about, the conventionally existent self and the conventionally existent mind, well, that is just another example of a possessor of parts and the parts, right? The self is the possessor of the parts, and the mind are the parts, the aggregates of the self. So then when we are analyzing, again, we're also analyzing mind, the self, right? When we're analyzing, and it comes back again to the same kinds of reasoning, like comes back like to the first, that first of the extremes refuted, or the first and second, am I the I, one nature with its parts, or different nature from its parts? How does that exist? So that analysis is you're analyzing both at the same time, essentially. So not exactly the wording Geshe said, but something like that. You're kind of, they're not analyzed separately. Oh, is there one in the chat? Oh yeah, there's one in the chat box here. Question 1 and question 2. There are 2 questions. Can it be said that the chariot is defined as being dependent on all the parts, therefore it can be found as dependent on the parts, but not established as independent? Therefore, by definition, it has no inherent nature, because inherent means without dependence on something else. And question 2, can it not be said that the chariot cannot be found outside the parts, nor in any single one of the parts, using the 7 extremes? These are 7 ways it is not established, but the chariot can be found as the sum of the parts, where each part that can be uniquely identified as belonging to the chariot is present in this sum, and the parts are properly assembled and functioning as that chariot. Okay, so there's probably just time for one of these, but start the first one. Again, any shinda dang shinda di yana di shinda ji mubo ne zo shinda di any shinda di yana la temba yens la na digere base temba yana yang any or that Ngawang tsu temba mayens la shingi tsu di temba mayens or kinsen de la tene and shingi ma drupa yens right jeni sana shingi dup kasi shingi dunas any shenla mitemba drupa kores or tenes sana digere
어디래 다다 디샤 신다 디랑이 야라라 타니도 템바인스 와파 템바인스 가스면 신다 라트디 랑이 야라 콜로다 강가라 주 뜨니 니 신이 차와 치게지라 신다 쓰고라 어디 타니도 우빈에서 뛰어봤지 다 랑신 주비수비 뛰어봤디 말했어 랑신 주비수비 때문에 라왕기 뛰수 세지들이 야 뛰메기 디나디고라 저랑기 디다다디 고다다 레샤스 디고레스.
Yes, your understanding is exactly correct. That's fine to say. So Geshe just added in the word, like in your first sentence, can it be said that the chariot is dependent on all the parts? It is conventionally dependent on the parts. That's Geshe added this word conventionally. So chariot is conventionally dependent on its parts. We have the wheels and the axle and all the different parts, and then all those brought together, then the chariot is dependent on them. It exists in dependence on them and can do the functions and actions of a chariot. However, it's not dependent on the parts in an intrinsic or a way of having a nature. And again, inherent nature is an addition in the English. The word is really just nature. So you can just think of nature, but if sometimes people add inherent in there. So yes, and that's exactly right. So the being established with the nature would mean being existing, established independently. So that's exactly correct. It's fine to say that. And June Nipa gonna then that the yana de losu manye yana yang ani chik yana the very little that 그런 예범에 마네나양스 아니 청마요 연락 최성 아니 동네 연락 최성 동네 아니 디 신가 니엔스 남나디게 연락 남 동네
노도 디 디체바데인다 디 인다디 리버 축구나 디 리그지 와 힌두산이 얘라 소바대양 신다 마레스 가스는 딘데는 신다기 딘데 얘라 누파 마리와체 콜로당지 강가야 루루 수니야 샤티스나 신다 콜로 옆에는 모자로지는 모다디 야 마지비 내가들은 모다기 빠빠당 나로국자당 콜로다 강가야 루루 수니 샤티스나 모자 인생 말아 모자스디 모자기 차와 진유게 얘라 강가 유비 땡도 모자기 차와 진유게지라 아니 모자스 따고 알아 모두 지금 뒤 초바 주고 나왔나 아니 코바 훅죄니 바 로로 죄니 야 루시니 써요데 초바도 열어 그래서 뒤 초바대 말해서 초바 소비 땡도 차와 진유지라 아니 모자스 따기도 신다세도 다가랑 아니 얘라디 차와 진유비 뭐지 신디 콜로기 차와 진유겐지 보고 어떤 레지라더니 신다스는 또 가지 못하지 난 초바 주고는 맞지고 말해서
So this actually question is addressed in the sixth reasoning or extreme the reasoning to negate it that will come next class. But to summarize it, we can't just say that the chariot is the sum of its parts, and the expression used in the text is the collection, but it actually means the exact same thing. So it's not the sum of its parts, because if it were the sum of its parts, then even in the period where the parts are not assembled together, there's still the sum of the parts are still there, or the all the parts are still there. Collection can be summed up, and yet there's no chariot there at that stage when the parts are not assembled. So if you look at a car, you take it apart and spread all the parts there, the collection of parts, or in other words, the sum of its parts is still there. However, there's no chariot. So that's why we could say then what is the car or the chariot? It's something that when the parts are all assembled and then it's functioning as a car, as a chariot, then we label chariot or car onto that. That's what the chariot is. Something that has to be able to function when parts are assembled in a certain way, and it functions as the car, as the chariot, then we label it car or chariot. So that's what we can say is the conventionally existing chariot or car.
Yeah. This one.
Okay. There's one more question. Janet, is it short?
I think it's short, but if it's not short, then it can wait. Okay. So should I try?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm a little lost on, like, if when the chariot's parts are all disassembled and spread out, it's not a chariot. And the parts are, I don't know, I don't understand why the parts have the same nature as the chariot, because the parts are I don't understand why they have the same nature. Because they're not, like, a wheel could be used for something else, a board could be used for something else.
죄송, 신다dan 신다기 연락이 뭐지긴소 거수되면 가르치니스나 그러나 콜로가 보이나요? 신다기 콜로지 아니 야 통네 야 아니 배치셔면 땅쪽으로 잘하시면 비자르초리스 대상 뭐지 간다스
네. 당주 선물로 디코트고 맞다 신다당 신디야가 오지기 말이 디코트면서 아니 강사당 강사기 풍고대 오지기 봐 선물 받고 선물들 오 타디비 선물로 레고 이제는다 디기 땡기 때문에 강사랑 심어도도 미엘라 계기치고 이제는 신다 모자이나 크기 야랄당 오지기 말이 모자라도 선물로 코인디 야라디 야 초바지라 저와 진유지 선물 코야지면 디를 로스 모자지 선물 콜수지요 말와 모자라 저지라 모자기 야라 차장 소니 아니 저와 지킨지라 선물 딘지 코어와 우리는 딘지 좋아 이는 아주 선물 땅인데 아니 모자기 야라당 모자 생한테 배도 뭐 로스요 와든지 콜로디 꼬니 신다라 가야도 빡바디 꼬니 신다라 가야도 딘지기 선물 땅인데 아니 뭐 소소는 요지 배나 말한서 미 라디 미게 야라지 꼬니 신다라 파자요 여러와 미 인간 미당 미게 야라디 강사다 강사비 야라디 뭐 소소는 요바 정지 않아서 쓰는 코드 거리 뭐 비즈니스라 뭔데 뭐 지도요 이제 뭐 소소는 요즈디 사모 코인데 안 때메기 펜스 때메기가 사모디 랑싱이 랑제스 레인데 뜨주기 아니 요즈디 사모 코마도 안상 랑싱 주바 진 거는 근데 그래서 다디 가스나 모두 신다 랍서시라 모자 랍서시라 모자기 요란도 초바들을 로수지 모자 샤에메와 와 모자기 요라 초비 차와 지긴들라 모자스니 바 똑비 따와와 와 마도지 모자스 민티파 마다 코니 아니 예라디기 되니 초바들라 되니 양 신다지 요와 있는데 지고 디요 말로 모자 랍서시라 모자기 예라 강가 속니 차와 지긴지라 아니 사무 되지 고고와 와 이는 무빈니스라 유수 디발라 삼로 코인데 모자다 모자게 야라디 벳코랑 오수수는 요가 지금 졸라 차디고 라바질 니 코인데 다 강사다 강사게 야라데야 아니 오수수는 요가 삼로 코인데 아니 뜨메기 랑싱디 레고 레드디는 랑싱을 두고 뜨주기 되니 로아 랑싱 두비 뜨메이나 랑싱 두고 고도 세게 삼로다니 코다 제라 강이 지고 와 근데서니 진짜지 돈이 다 삼고와이나 아니 모자 라들 람상 모자게 다시 아니 콜로당 강아 손에 저와 지게지 모두 지금 삼고 코즈 메와지라 네바 데트나 아니 모자다 모자게 해라디 오지 뭐 삼고 디엔드드니 뜨주 세 그저 뜨주 디엔이 강사라 주 삼부나 아니 신이 아니 강사게 랑시 모두 니스들 아니 콜리빈 정시 오 진짜지 삼부당니 다디 삼부당당디 다 말아준 내주당 농촌이 뱃고라서는 뭐가 시작해서 진짜게 진짜 중요한 거래스.
So this is funny. It's the that point is kind of because it's difficult for us to think about the chariot and its parts in the way that they really are the relationship they actually have to each other. So that because of that, that this kind of way of thinking about it will come up that we can take off the wheels and put it onto something else. Therefore, they're not one nature. That itself is kind of creates a little bit of a block or obstacle to being able to do the meditation properly on refuting the 7 extremes here. So when we think about it, what we're really saying here is that the chariot and the parts they're one nature because if you conceive of a chariot, right? What are you conceiving of? What is actually coming to mind, right? What's coming to mind is this thing that functions, the chariot functions and has such parts. It's something which is, dependent on these parts of a chariot, the collected parts, assembled parts of a chariot that functions as a chariot. That's what you're thinking of when you think of a chariot, when you conceive of a chariot. So if you kind of have the conception that, your chariot and the parts are different because you can separate out the parts. Well, but when you're actually thinking of a chariot, can you think of a chariot? Can you conceive of a chariot which has no parts? Right? When you conceive of a chariot, it is something which is together that it is dependent on its parts, that has parts. So, you can't think there's not a chariot that's somehow just completely separate from parts, right? It's independent. And the same with ourselves. You could take off you can cut off your arm and give it to someone else, or an organ, or you can take different parts of yourself and give them to someone else. But the person and the aggregates, or yourself and your aggregates, are one nature. And so this really is coming up because we have a difficulty in, or our natural sense or perception is that we have a way of things appearing to us, or being the way we experience things, the way things appear to us, is different from the way they actually exist. Or in other words, there's a difference between the appearance and the reality. So this is where this obstacle comes, but it is very much the sort of meaning here is that things are one nature, so that the parts that the object is designated upon its parts and upon the basis of its parts.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we'll stop the class here.
Chere se wang ten ten jia zu yin xia pe se de pa ten ju ro ji ka ten du ji kam su chi le ju to ju da bi lu do yin lo se nam la ri la mong de ne de lam de ji bi shi so wa de chang ju sim ju rin bu ji ma ji pa ye ju Kewa nyamba meba yang kone kong pewa shu tazi nigu sebe meji samu tenze tatang chag. Pacho lu tu yapse gongba da jishi kongdo ji yoru ngu jewa di jewu gu sonama ishi zozo sonama ishi le ju Thank you, Tujiche. Good night, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.